We need to introduce the Executive Director of the Transgender Law Center, Macy Davis, who's going to walk us through some of the findings of the Transgender Survey. When we sign, I will go ahead and facilitate a discussion regarding what we have just heard and seen. Okay, Macy Davis.
Good morning. I am so thrilled to see everybody here, especially at 9:10 on Saturday morning. Thank you all so much for demonstrating such leadership by just coming to this weekend's conference, connecting and networking with other transgender community members and allies throughout California and sometimes beyond, to look at some of the issues facing our community and solutions to improving the well-being for all of us in this room and outside of the room. I'm going to be sharing some of the findings of a 2008 economic health survey that the Transgender Law Center conducted in 2008. And the survey goals when we originally launched this was to really start creating a snapshot of the economic health of transgender Californians. Because as we looked at data and to reflect what was going on in our communities, we realized that we're not counted in the census, right? Not many people are researching us other than perhaps around HIV issues or substance abuse issues. And we just had a lack overall of data and information about who we are, what we experience, how our employment, healthcare, and housing situations progress as we transition. And so we wanted to fill some of that gap. We also thought this was really important because we believe strongly, and we hear from almost 1,000 people a year at the Transgender Law Center, that we need to improve access to resources for our community. We know that we have high levels of poverty. We have many people who are looking for public services, employment services, healthcare services. They're not being met. And without having good data to talk about what we experience as people, it's really hard for us to talk to policymakers or healthcare providers or decision makers about the need to change their services or to invest in us without good data. So we're hoping we can do this. Now, I've got a pretty short period of time. This is a massive survey. So I'm going to go through some stuff pretty quickly. You're going to get a summary of the survey results as you leave today. Okay, so you're going to get some of this information. But I want to let you know, we did have help from a lot of folks who gave us some input as we were designing the survey. It was supported by a few foundations, both locally in California and throughout the country, and we're very appreciative to them, especially the State Equality Fund, the California Women's Foundation, and the Williams Institute for providing support, as well as folks like Mark Kiesling, who helped take a look at it and say, okay, do these questions make sense? That's, not to say that anything wrong with it is Mara's fault, so we can blame her. But instead to say that we take full responsibility for any problems, and we thank the people who helped us make this as successful as it was. For the survey, we distributed hard copies that we mailed to all the transgender and LGBT organizations we could identify in California. We also distributed via SurveyMonkey in English and Spanish. And once we looked at just the California adults who identified as transgender, we had 646 people that we ended up counting. So I'm going to run through quickly who we are and the demographics of what we found, the key findings, and then dig a little deeper in some of the areas that really stood out to us as we looked at the data. And then we want to hear from you all about some of the implications that you see based on what we talk about today. So that's what I think you'll be facilitating later. So I'm going to suggest, if you have a question about the finding, or you say, if this and this is true, what about this? Please jot those down, keep them in your head, because we're going to be able to talk about that in a minute. Does that sound good? Excellent. So first, I'm going to talk about who responded. We found, and this language is always rough, but basically we had a pretty good representation, I would say, of what we would consider transgender men and transgender women. Folks who'd been assigned male at birth were overrepresented, meaning we have more what I would interpret that to mean as transgender women and transgender men. But compared to a lot of the other surveys about the transgender community, we have a more equal split. Not surprisingly for this group, there are a lot of different kinds of gender identities that were reflected. We let people choose their gender identity and choose more than one gender identity. So I think it's really interesting to see, obviously, that we had a lot of, I don't think this, so see if it works. A lot of transgender and transsexual identified folks, as well as male to female or trans woman and female to male trans men. Starts to drop off a little bit more than around gender part of the transgender community. But I do think it's worth noting as we look at the results, we are high on transsexual folks, and probably a number of people who've sought some sort of medical support for their transition. The ethnicity of respondents for us was a challenge. I want to point out that in California generally, about 43% of folks identify as white as their main ethnicity, with 36% as Latino. In our survey, in the sample, we got 63% of folks who are white and 13% Latino. Now, other areas like there generally are about 6% of California's population are black, 6% of our survey, that's good. But we were definitely underrepresented with Latinos and Asia-Pacific Islanders. The other odd thing is, in the California population, you see only 2% of people identify as two or more races, whereas 12% did in our sample. So to me, that just kind of says that we have kind of more complex identities in some ways, or ways that we think about our identities than the average person. But when I go through the data results on this, I'm really mindful that this is a disproportionately white and potentially privileged population, okay? So as we talk about the findings here, my guess is this is about as good as it gets, right? That as we look at rates of discrimination and employment, it's probably worse because we know generally in California, race, and specifically whiteness, is associated with higher income and education rates. We've got a good split of age. We only looked at adults, working age adults, because we really wanted to focus on employment issues and income. But generally, a pretty good spread of our largest group in the 25 to 34-year-old range. Sexual orientation I always think is interesting, especially since I'm oftentimes asked why trans people should be part of the broader LGBT movement. And it was, certainly fascinating to see. Certainly 18% of us identify as gay or lesbian, 17% is bisexual, 21% is queer, 27% straight. We have complex identities and sexual orientations. Regionally, we ended up getting survey results from 33 of the 58 counties in California. We are disproportionately heavy in the urban areas, which is probably not surprising, especially since we went to a lot of the social groups that we were aware of, organizations that we can connect with. Oftentimes, you have a bigger infrastructure in the urban areas to have that kind of dissemination of information. So we have, when you look at the results, it's going to be heavy on San Francisco, LA, Alameda County, San Diego, and Santa Clara. A whole 23% of the respondents were from San Francisco, with 17 from LA. So I want to talk quickly about education because I thought that was one of our more interesting findings. One of the findings we have is that the respondents to this survey were twice as likely to hold a bachelor's degree compared to the general population in California. Can I say that again? Okay. Our transgender adult respondents were twice as likely to have a bachelor's degree. Okay? And 94% over the age of 24 had a high school diploma. That is very different than what we see as far as California generally. So now, again, remember, this is a predominantly white sample, right? And so I want to make sure that folks are aware of that. But as people are talking about the need for well-trained workers out there in the workforce, we got a lot of them. And I always try to remember that. But I do want to acknowledge and make sure folks are looking at this data realize that there are definitely educational disparities among transgender people, right? And some of this is not just about the transgender community, but we did find within the survey that the racial background strongly impacts education levels among the transgender folks, with over 40% of the white respondents having a degree and 14% of people of color having a degree. So as we're looking at educational access issues for our community, we really need to look at what's going on that our communities of color are not accessing and able to access education at the same rate and level. And I'm going to ask people to hold questions until we're done. So basically, we've got some good news and bad news. In California, we have some of the best laws protecting transgender and gender nonconforming people from discrimination and harassment. We have been protected in employment since 2004 and housing since 2004. We even are covered under public accommodations laws. We even have an Insurance Gender Non-Discrimination Act. So when it comes to state laws, we're pretty well covered. At the same time, we've got this pretty high rate, it seems, of higher education, at least among white transgender people. The bad news is, even despite all of that, we have 70% of our respondents reporting that they've experienced workplace discrimination related to their gender identity. We're finding that while we may have twice as many people who are getting bachelor's degrees, we also find that transgender people are twice as likely to be living below the poverty line of $10,400 compared to the general population of California. 1 out of 5 of our people who responded said that they have been homeless since they transitioned. And 30% said that they were postponing care, or had postponed care at some point, health care, because they were concerned about discriminatory treatment by providers. So we've got a lot of work to do. I'm going to go through these really quickly, but I found it kind of interesting to see, like, where are we in employment? Overall, we found that transgender Californians work in a whole bunch of different fields, with a lot of us, especially in professional specialty fields, executive positions, and service and retail. We are working among a lot of employers, and I think it's interesting because certainly where I sit, I run into a lot of transgender people working in the social services. I tend to think, oh, we're disproportionately represented in the nonprofit sector. What we found actually is the majority of us are working for private for-profit companies, then nonprofit, then government, and fewer self-employed. So while we're in a lot of occupations, working in a lot of different sectors, we still find that fewer than half of the people we talk to were employed full-time. Okay? Fewer than half were employed full-time. And again, this is a disproportionately privileged population, right? The samples of folks we talk to, overeducated, more white than the average in the state, and fewer than half are working full-time. Now we've got a high number of folks too, as you can see here, who are employed part-time, and a number of folks who are unemployed, 14% at the time that we did this survey, and 80% on disability. But I'd be interested in looking at how does that compare with other averages across the state. So as I mentioned, compared to the general population of California, we're twice as likely to live in poverty. We're twice as likely to be unemployed. The unemployment rate at the time when we did the survey was 7% in 2008, and at the time transgender people reported 14% were unemployed. As the unemployment rate increased significantly over the last several months, we would anticipate that the transgender unemployment rate likely has as well. And I think it's worth noting that 23% of the people who answered this are living below the federal poverty line. So 23% of the folks who surveyed were earning less than $10,400 a year. This is kind of a complicated slide, but basically what we're finding is that about half, technical difficulties, that about half of folks have experienced some loss of employment, either through they have direct information that they know that this is why they were fired, or they think that this is why they were fired. And there is a correlation between losing your job and your income. So not surprising, and some of this is kind of a dog factor, as I call it, but that if you've lost your job, you're less likely to make as much money. What we found actually that people who've lost their job once due to their gender identity are, on average, make less than $10,000 a year than somebody who's never lost their job based on gender identity. It's a little complicated. People following me? That the experience of losing our job based on our gender identity may not just have impact at that moment, but actually, even years later, we're less likely to be making as much money due to that initial job loss. As I mentioned earlier, 70% reported some sort of workplace harassment. Most of that was being harassed by coworkers or supervisors, some unfair scrutiny. We had about 11% who said that they were denied access to the appropriate restroom at work. Half believe they've lost their job because of their gender identity. 30% said they're currently unemployed because they're transgender. And 14% said they've been fired just because they're trans. And what I think is a very much related statistic to this, 1 out of 4 report that they've worked in the street economy. Which makes sense, right? If people are finding economic challenges, they're losing their jobs, they're getting low income wages, and then people actually lose another job. The next place for a lot of folks is the street, and trying to find different ways to do survival sex, or look at other ways to make money so that they can keep going. While we have good laws right now, we found that only 15% of the people who said that they had workplace discrimination complaints had actually filed a complaint. So people are not, even when we are experiencing discrimination, we're not standing up for ourselves or at least filing any kind of formal complaint to go through channels to address that. Most of that is because people don't think that they are going to get any assistance. 44% said that. 30% said they didn't know how they had legal protections in California, which means we've got to spread the word that we are protected when something happens in the workplace. And 27% didn't know where to go to file a complaint. So I think there's some education work here we can do. And understandably, I believe 26% thought, well, if I complain, I'm going to lose my job. I thought this was an interesting slide. I'm not going to go through it, but I want to compare it to note that if you looked at actually what people wanted in employment, so we asked, well, where would you like to work, regardless of what you're doing now. When we asked people what they wanted, 54% said they wanted a professional specialty, and only 4% said service or retail, which is pretty different than where people are right now. Right now we've got 46% in professional specialty and 14% in sales. So it suggests to me that many of us are doing some work in areas that may not be the best fit for us. Perhaps we're working in areas because we don't feel like we've got other options, able to find other jobs. Be interested to hear people's take on that. But folks did say they'd like help around employment, especially help networking. We had a number of people who said they needed help with identity documents to make sure that their documentations matched to help secure employment. People wanted to continue education, help coming out of work, career training, and counseling. You know, whenever we think about employment, then we think about healthcare as well. And one of the surprising findings for us in the survey is that we found that 76% of people said that they were covered by some sort of insurance, whether that's private insurance, Medi-Cal, or whatnot. So this was in some ways good news to us. Now we know, certainly at the Transgender Law Center, that having insurance doesn't mean you can use the insurance, right? So this does not mean that these are insurance policies that do not exclude transition-related care. It just means that people do have insurance, so if they break their arm, hopefully they have some way to take care of that. Even with that high insurance rate, we find an alarmingly high rate of denial of basic health care services. So you've got 21% being denied counseling and mental health, 33% denied surgery. I think this is a little less surprising than some of the others because we know that surgeries are hard to come by these days through insurance certainly. 27% have been denied hormones, 15% denied gender-specific care, such as pap smears for trans men, prostate exams for trans women, and 11% had a provider actually refuse to treat them because they're transgender. We find that affordable counseling care is very hard to find. 35% of people said that they educated their own provider in order to get good care, and a lot of people were postponing care because of either lack of ability to pay or discriminatory treatment. And as a result, 26% had medical conditions that had gotten worse because they postponed care. Just want to touch on housing really quickly. 20% of our folks, 1 out of 5, said that they'd been homeless since they came out as transgender. For those who have been homeless, we talked to them about their experiences within the shelter system. And we found really chronic levels of discrimination and harassment within housing services. 31% denied access to a shelter, 40% harassed by other shelter residents, 31% by staff, 15% thrown out once people found out they were trans, and 33% just leaving the shelter system altogether due to poor treatment and unsafe conditions. So we have an incredibly high rate of homelessness, and a large number of folks are not able to get basic homeless services, putting them at more risk. So I ran through a lot of data around economic, health, education, housing issues. On one hand, I was working on the implications. When I was working on this PowerPoint and looking at the data, I started getting a little depressed. And so I just want to share that. Because we've been working in California, many of us around the room, and nationally, many of us around the room, to improve the quality of life for transgender people. We've passed good laws, we've created programs, we've gotten funding, we've created organizations, and we're still finding really high rates of discrimination, high rates of folks being denied access to health care, high rates of homelessness. We've got a lot of work still to do. I also want to put, though, on the other side, when I think, okay, less than half are working, we do have almost half that are working. And so I want to look at it on the other side, too, because I know when I came out as transgender, transgender 12 years ago or so, I assumed I would lose my job if I came out as transgender. And I know that that was the case for a lot of people around me. And I think there are a lot of ways to look at these numbers. On one hand, if the glass half empty, we got a lot of work to do, without a doubt, and we've got to figure some of this stuff out. On the other hand, my guess is if we had done this kind of survey 5 or 10 years ago, the numbers would be even worse. And we do have people working in executive positions. We have people who are making it through school. We have some folks, really shocked me a little bit. I want to know where to find these people. We have folks that make more than 100,000 a year. So we have some strengths as well, and we are making progress slowly but surely. We have a long ways to go still. And so I wanted to ask Vicki to lead in the discussion to talk about, what the implications are that you see as you hear these numbers, and what you would suggest we do to further improve them.